Hey everybody, welcome to Drive Thru Review 315. Today we're going to talk about Mars Attacks the Miniatures game. This is from Mantic Games. The only other game I played from Mantic was Dreadball, which I quite enjoyed. And this is a 3D tactical skirmish miniatures board game. So it's actually a board game, and the interesting thing about this game is that it is made up of 3D terrain, and the line of sight is what you might call real or true line of sight. So when you want to see if you have line of sight from maybe your Martian onto one of the Marines, you're going to get down, take a look through any of the rubble and terrain, and you're going to see, do I have line of sight? If you have complete line of sight on the model, which means you can see every part of the model, including the base, and then you get to add an extra die to your attack roll. If you can only see part of the model, then you roll the base 3 dice, which is another interesting thing about the game, is that all of the attacks and fights and survival checks is 3 dice, and you kind of plus or minus different modifiers, which is similar to how Dreadball works. But if you can't see the model, then you can't see it, you can't shoot it. As I said, the game is a 3D miniatures skirmish game. One side will take on the role of the Martians, the other side will take on the role of the humans. And the humans will have a variety of heroes that they can control. So you'll have just kind of your normal Marines, and you'll have like a sergeant, and then you'll have these different folks that, you know, have survived the apocalypse of the Martian attack. They'll have different skills, different attributes and sort of characteristics that make them very unique compared to sort of your generic Marines. The Martians have one hero, and that's General Tor. Now, the first thing to note about this game is the components. And in my estimation, the components are fantastic. Everything from the rulebook to the models, to the different terrain, to the cards, to the artwork, everything is great about this game. It's very indicative of the theme. It pays, I think, a great tribute to the subject matter and this universe. Even the rulebook itself is actually really cool. Now, it's not your traditional rulebook. It's almost like a magazine style rulebook, which on the surface might seem like a not great way to digest and index and reference information, but it actually works pretty well. And that being said, I have downloaded a player aid from Board Game Geek. There's this 2-page player aid that I'll put a link to in the description here, which is nice. The rulebook actually is a fine way to reference in the material if you need to look up the stats for a particular unit or something like that. It's very easy to look up what a special ability it is. It's very easy. It's just easier to, instead of paging through a book, to actually just, you know, have 1 or 2 sheets of paper here in front of you. Now, the quote-unquote board itself is actually a paper map, but that's not all there is to the board. Now, you're going to fold this out, and you can see it's divided into various grids, and it's an 8x8 map. And these are the spaces that players are going to be moving their figures around in. Now, on top of this grid, you're going to lay down your 3D terrain. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the human player actually is the one that's going to set up all of the terrain. And then the Martian player is going to basically pick the side of the board that they're going to approach on and set up their figures, and then the human player will set up their figures. Now, you're going to do this based on one of the 10 scenarios in the book. And they leave it pretty open in terms of how you set up the terrain. Sometimes in a scenario, they'll be like, okay, this certain spot should be where it has the most cover, or you might put a certain thing in one of the grids. But for the most part, it's pretty open. So your initial setup of the first scenario you play, if you're going to sit down and play a session of this, it's going to be a little bit cumbersome, and maybe, you know, the human player should, you know, set stuff up while the Martian player gets the snacks or whatever you might be doing. But once you have some of the terrain clipped together, then it's very easy to, you know, break it down a little bit, you know, change it around and then play a different scenario, or just move pieces around to kind of give you a different look. So it actually works pretty well, and the terrain is very, you know, good quality, very easy to snap together. I kind of wish there was a little bit more, but I kind of feel like I'm being like a beggar can't be chooser, because there is a good amount of terrain and you can set things up. I just wish there was like a little bit more variety in the style of terrain or something, but I feel like I'm being a little bit greedy there. Now, the scenarios themselves are really fun. So they kind of have a story arc through them very loosely, but they are different feeling scenarios. You might have a little setup and just kind of wipe the other guy out. Now, most of the time what you're doing is trying to get 8 victory points, and the way the scenarios are set up is you're going to get victory points in certain ways. You don't just get victory points for killing the other guy. You get victory points for uncovering secret, objectives and things that might be laid out on the board prior to setup or during setup. and you might get objectives for killing certain people, not just everybody, or getting someone from one side of the map to the other, trying to make an escape route through the Martians, or you make your way to the Martian spaceship to upload a virus a la Independence Day and blow up the main Martian ship and stuff like that. So there is some variety and some nice, thematic and cinematic elements to the different scenarios. Now, there's a couple things you can do on your turn. For the most part, you're going to activate 2 models and then pass the play to your opponent, who's going to activate 2 models. But you can also activate 1 model and then play 1 card. The cards themselves are pretty interesting because you're either going to have event cards in the game, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and then all of the player cards that you're going to play during your turn are double-sided. So one half of the card is going to be available to the human player and the other half will be available to the Martian player. So you're drawing out of the same deck. Now, the card play is pretty interesting. You have your basic cards that are going to augment combat, give you extra dice, and affect combat and that kind of thing. Then you have these other cards which are like support cards, and you can play these and sort of build them up. So the Martians might call down a big ray blast from one of their flying saucers. Well, you can play a card just like that and maybe you'll roll 3 dice, or the effect will only maybe rattle your opponent versus actually inflict a wound on them. Or if you play that card and leave it down and then you draw another card on a later turn or have one in your hand, you can play the exact matching card and you build up to a stronger and stronger ray. And the humans have the similar thing with artillery barrages. Now, there are cards that will cancel out any sort of buildup of support. You may cancel it, and so you'll interrupt it before they have a chance to do their really big blast. So that's a really cool way of adding in this sort of hidden, all-seeing large object that you could never squeeze over the board, the big ray guns, the big missile barrage and stuff like that. So that the card play is really a fun, cool part of the game. When you activate a character, you'll just do what your action you're going to do with them, and then you'll place an activation token next to them to show that they've been activated for that round. And each of the models can do a basic thing. They can move 2 spaces, and that's basically just moving 2 grid spaces. They can move 1 space and then make an attack. If they've been rattled, then you'll have laid the figure down, and then they can stand up and shoot or stand up and attack. And you might have to stand them up and fight if there is an enemy unit in the same square as them. Now, the combat is very straightforward. Simply what you're going to do is, let's say you were going to do a shoot. And so you're going to roll 3 dice, and then you're going to take a look at that particular character, that figure's target number. So in the case of a US trooper with a carbine that we see here, they have to roll a 5 or higher. Now, if they took an action to aim, that's going to add another die to their pool. And if they have a clear line of sight, which means they can see every part of the model that they're attacking, you're going to add an additional die. You're going to take that shot, and then the Martian is going to roll base number 3 dice, and they're going to compare that to their survive, which is a 6+ in this case, so not the greatest survival rate. If the attacker has more successes than the defender, then the defender will die. So it's very simple in that way. Now, there is a lot of mitigation that you can do. There's cards that will bring characters into play, like a new, reinforcements will show up and stuff like that. And all of the different characters have different abilities. It's the nice thing about the player aid is being able to look up, oh, what does this do again? What does Brave do? What does Mr. Fix-It do? And all that kind of stuff like that. So there's a lot of special abilities to sort of digest, and that's one thing you're going to spend a lot of time in the rulebook looking up your first couple of times, is that. But it's very neat because it gives all of them, sort of a caricature kind of feel to it. Some of the heroic named characters in the game are going to be allotted a certain number of heroic points, and one of the actions that they can do is spend these heroic points to engage in some of these special abilities that are unique to them. And these are all the points that they get for the entirety of the game, so you've got to spend them very carefully and very wisely. Now, the final part that I want to talk about in this game is my absolute favorite part of the game, and that is the event cards. So every round you're going to replenish your hand back up to 4 cards, and if you happen to draw an event card, then you're going to play it immediately and then do whatever it says and then keep drawing back up to your hand size. So here you can see one of the examples of the event cards, and that's the mutant bug. And this tells you to place the mutant bug counter in a random square. And there's a lot of times in the game it'll tell you to do a random square. You roll the 2d8, and then you figure out the coordinates based on, you know, your orientation to the board, and then you figure out the square that way. And what the bug basically is going to do is scatter everybody wherever it lands, and then try to grab one of the character models and scurry away with it. Some of the events will actually bring on innocent civilians that the human player can rescue for victory points, and the Martian player can abduct for victory points. One thing I forgot to mention is that in some of the scenarios, you'll let these secret objectives face down, and sometimes they will be critters for the aliens to, you know, capture and do experiments on, or there'll be some little nebulous piece of alien tech. And that's a way for each side to get victory points in addition to whatever kind of the main scenario is that will give victory points. That gives you kind of a tactical, you know, spot on the board to fight over in some ways. But my absolute favorite event card is the Moo card. And this will bring in a giant herd of burning cows to come onto the board. And these cows are just going to run all over the board, killing everything in sight, and just pissed off cattle on fire. So that is the gist of the game, and I have to tell you, I am very surprised. I am friggin' in love with this game. It is hilarious. The combat's simple. I love the card play. So many things. So let's just kind of go back through it quickly so I can kind of summarize. The components are great. I love the artwork in the rulebook. I love the artwork on the cards. The models are great. The Martians got their little helmets. You know, the little counters for the burning cows and the innocent civilians and all that stuff is really cool. So they did a great job with that. The card play itself is really cool. I like how you can build up those little support cards and try to build up to a big attack, and then, you know, but you're running the risk of being interrupted, you know, by another card play. The event cards are obviously awesome. I love that because you start off with a scenario, and you may have some innocent civilians, like, as the Marines are like, oh, okay, we got to save these people as we try to get Billy over here to, put a virus in the alien ship and all that stuff. So that's cool. Or the next time you play, you might have a giant burning herd of cows come into the game. I just love that card. All right, so it's cool and it works, and it's random, but that's what the game is. I mean, it's a fun game. It's funny. It's great that way. I love the combat. I love that it's to me it's amazing, and maybe I'm maybe a little bit overwhelmed too much by it, but I love that. Oh, well, line of sight. Can you see them? You don't have to count hexes. You don't have to worry about, is there terrain and this terrain does this effect and this effect. No, can you see them? Then roll dice. If you cannot see them, you do not roll dice. Now, I will say, you can get into situations where you have to house rule it, because the game is sort of designed to set up kind of perfectly 90-degree angle terrain and all that stuff, kind of right along the grid hexes. And we played a game where we got really into how we were setting it up, and so we had sort of rubble, and we're like, well, couldn't he kind of crawl through this space? How would that work? So we kind of house rule that if there's anything in the way there that they can't physically move the model right through, then just consider it a wall. For the effect of aesthetics, it's rubble, but for the effect of gameplay, it's going to be a wall. So, I don't have the wall going right to the vertices of the grid, so can I just move around that and say, no, well, you just go around and you've got to move diagonally or whatever, so that counts as a space. So it's actually two movements to get around the wall. And I think that's fair because, he'd probably be climbing over the rubble and stuff. So I think that's okay. And there are a couple of situations like that. There is a FAQ. I'll try to remember to put the link up to the FAQ. Not anything really bad with the rules. It's oh, I read the FAQ and I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. It wasn't 100% clear from the rules, but when you go back and read it, it's okay, it's there. But I would read the FAQ just so you don't have any issues with your first game. What else? I like the combat. I like the whole 3 dice, and you just modify how many dice you roll. Like I said, they did that in Dreadball. It makes it very easy and intuitive to quickly calculate, what kind of modifiers I'm going to be using for the attack and all that kind of stuff without getting real cumbersome and heavy. I like the special abilities, and I like the different hero characters that are involved, and they kind of add their own little spice and flavor to the game. But most of all, it's just fun to set up a game and play, and you kind of feel like you're playing a miniatures game. You can set your guy however you want, in the grid. So it's like, okay, I move from this grid to this grid, but within the space of that grid, he can duck under cover, he can peek over this way. You don't have to worry too much about it. You're not measuring anything. So they've gotten rid of that whole aspect of it. Now, from what I understand, this is sort of the simplified version of the Dead Zone system. So if that seems familiar to you and you've played Dead Zone, there's a reason why. So I don't know if how much more involved that is, but I think if you like this game, I hope to check out Dead Zone. It looks pretty cool. But I really like this theme though. I don't know what this theme of Dead Zone is, but this is a great theme. And I really hope they release more, mats for it. This is just kind of a city street. I hope they release more, different terrain tiles and snap-ons. The stuff works really well. You just snap them in. There's these little clips. You can use the clips to help them stand up and set up all the terrain stuff like that. So I hope they kind of reinvestigate this, more scenarios, maybe more decks of cards and different, models and stuff, and standees that they can come out with. So it's a good system. And, it's not, I really haven't heard a lot about it. I just saw it announced at Gen Con and took a look. If you saw my demo at Gen Con, it looked pretty cool. So I'm glad I played this because I'm really, really surprised by how fun and interesting and just what a blast to play this game really is. So anyway, Mars Attacks, I definitely highly recommend this game. I think you'll have a great time with it. Thanks.